My name is William, and I've spent my entire life in this quiet coastal town, the kind of place where everyone knows your name and secrets drift through the air like mist, impossible to hide. I'm 26 now, and I work at the local library. Until recently, I kept the most important part of myself hidden, not just from others, but sometimes even from myself. I was raised in a traditional, religious household. My parents weren't harsh, but Saturday services were never optional, and our church community shaped nearly every part of our lives. As a kid, I found comfort in the routine, the familiar hymns, the warm greetings, the sense of belonging. But as I got older and began to truly understand who I was, that comfort slowly turned into a quiet storm of guilt and fear. By the time I hit my early 20s, I'd mostly stopped going to church. I blamed it on work, said I was too busy. But the truth ran deeper. I couldn't reconcile the person I was becoming with the beliefs I'd been raised on. Of course, my parents noticed. They asked gentle questions, extended kind invitations to holiday services, and sometimes I'd catch a disappointed sigh when I said no. But they never pushed too hard. Maybe they sensed something fragile inside me, something they weren't ready to confront or risk breaking. Then, 6 months ago, everything shifted. My dad had a heart attack. He survived, thank God. But those long, terrifying hours in the hospital waiting room changed something in all of us. In those moments of fear, I found myself praying, not in the structured, routine way I used to on Saturday mornings, but in quiet, desperate thoughts sent out into the unknown. When my dad finally stabilized, I felt two things at once, a wave of relief and a deep sense of shame. Relief that he was okay, shame that it took a crisis to make me reach out for faith again. The Saturday after he came home, I surprised my parents by saying I'd go to church with them. My mom cried. She said it was out of joy that my father was recovering. And maybe that was true. But something else had changed too. The church wasn't the same place I remembered. Father Matthews, the priest from my childhood, had retired. In his place was someone new, Father Jack. He was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, with a warm smile and eyes that seemed to really see people. Not just look at them, see them. After the service, he came over and talked with my parents, asking about my dad's health with what felt like genuine concern. Then he turned to me, held out his hand, and said, "So, you must be the elusive son I've heard about." His voice was light but kind. "William," I replied, suddenly nervous. "Not so elusive, just busy." He smiled, still meeting my eyes. "Everyone's busy, but it's good to make time for what matters, right?" I didn't know how to answer, so I just nodded and smiled. On the walk to the car, my mom went on about how wonderful the new priest was, how he'd brought new energy to the church. I stayed quiet, wondering why that brief conversation had left me so unsettled. Over the next few weeks, I kept going back to church. I told myself it was for my parents, especially for my dad, who was healing slowly but surely. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. Something about Father Jack's sermons spoke to me. He didn't preach about sin or punishment. He talked about passion, understanding, and grace. His words centered around love, real, human love, and I found myself holding on to them, hoping there might still be room in this faith I once cherished for someone like me. 4 months after I started attending again, I began staying after services to help with the church's outreach programs. At first, it was just to make my parents happy. They were overjoyed at my renewed involvement. But soon I found I actually enjoyed it. We ran food drives, visited elderly members of the community, and helped refurbish the church's little library. Father Jack was often there too, working alongside the volunteers. Sometimes his sleeves were rolled up, his collar slightly loosened. During those afternoons, we'd talk. At first, it was casual, Books, he was a big reader. Music, bits of the town's history. He had this way of listening that made you feel like every word you said truly mattered. As time went on, our conversations grew deeper. He shared parts of his journey to the priesthood, and it wasn't as straight a path as I'd expected. He studied literature in college, taught English in South America for 2 years. Only after that did he feel the call to enter the seminary. "I think God leads us on winding roads sometimes," he told me once as we sorted through boxes of donated books. "Detours matter," he said, "even when we don't understand them." I wondered if he could see meaning in my detours, if he understood the path I was walking. There were moments when I almost told him, "Life without love is like a tree without blossoms or fruit." He nodded slowly. The church hasn't always been a welcoming place for LGBTQ+ people. That's true. Different denominations, and even individual priests, hold different beliefs. But I believe in a God of love and inclusion. I believe Jesus taught us to love our neighbors as ourselves, without exceptions. Tears welled up in my eyes, hot, sudden, and overwhelming. "I stopped coming to church," I whispered, "because I thought there was no room for someone like me." "There is always a place for you here," he said, gently but with conviction. "And I'm sorry if the church ever made you feel otherwise." We talked for hours after that. By the time we looked up, the sun had long since disappeared, and the only light came from a small lamp on the desk. Its soft glow wrapped around us like a cocoon. A quiet circle where, for the first time in years, I felt safe enough to speak without fear. I told him everything. How I'd realized I was gay in high school. How terrified I'd been. How I used to sneak off to nearby towns just to go on dates, places where no one knew me. How lonely it felt to hide something so central to who I was, even from my own family, even from my community. Father Jack never interrupted. He listened, fully present, as if every word mattered. And when I paused, he shared stories of other LGBTQ+ Christians he had supported. He talked about interpretations of Scripture that affirmed their identities, that spoke to love rather than condemnation. He opened up about his own spiritual journey, how he came to believe in a more inclusive faith. He admitted that not everyone in the church agreed with him. But disagreement, he said, doesn't make compassion wrong. The greatest commandment is to love, he said, not to judge, not to exclude, to love. By the time we realized how late it was, the church was completely still. The night air had grown cool around us. He insisted on walking me to my car. As we reached it, he placed a steady, reassuring hand on my shoulder. "I'm glad you told me, William. I hope you'll keep coming back." I nodded, unable to speak for a moment, my throat tight with emotion. The relief I felt was unlike anything I'd known. "Thank you," I said softly, "for listening, for understanding." His hand lingered just a moment longer before he stepped back. "Same time next Saturday?" he asked. "Food pantry set up." "I'll be here," I replied, and I meant it. Driving home, I felt lighter than I had in years. The fear wasn't completely gone. I still hadn't told my parents. I still worried what others in the congregation might think. But something had shifted. Opening up to Father Jack, and being met with kindness instead of rejection, had cracked the wall I'd built around myself. That week, everything felt different. I moved through my days with a new sense of energy. At the library, I suggested LGBTQ+ inclusive titles for our next book display, and for the first time I did it without fear. I smiled more freely, laughed more easily. Friends had started to notice the change. The burden of hiding was lifting, slowly but surely. The weight I'd carried for so long felt a little lighter. By the time Saturday rolled around, I could finally breathe a bit easier, and I was eager to get back to the church. The food pantry setup wasn't scheduled until the afternoon, but I showed up early, hoping to catch a moment alone with Father Jack before the other volunteers arrived. I found him in the parish hall, already arranging tables and stacking shelving units. "You're early," he said with a warm smile as I walked in. "Eager to sort canned goods?" he teased. "Something like that," I replied, stepping in to help him with a particularly awkward shelf. "Actually, I wanted to thank you again. For last week. For how you responded when I came out to you." He paused, then turned to face me fully. "You don't need to thank me for treating you with the basic dignity you deserve, William." "Maybe not," I said quietly, "but it still meant a lot." I hesitated for a second, then added, "I've been thinking about what you said, that God created me as I am. I want to believe that." "What's stopping you?" he asked gently. I took a breath before answering. "A lifetime of hearing the opposite, I guess. It's hard to unlearn all of that overnight." Father Jack nodded, thoughtful. "Faith is a journey, not a finish line," he said. "Questioning, revisiting what you've been taught. That's not weakness. That's how you grow into a faith that's truly your own." We kept working while we talked. Our conversation flowed easily, shifting between theology and personal stories, between scripture and the quiet realities of being human. He shared more about his own path. How, during seminary, he went through a season of doubt, even questioned his calling. "I think God values honesty more than certainty," he said, as we adjusted the final table. "Life without love is like a tree without blossoms or fruit." I actually planned it before our talk last week, but now it feels especially relevant. "Will you—" I paused, unsure how to finish the question. "Mention me," he finished for me with a gentle laugh. "Of course not. Everything you've shared with me is confidential, William." A quiet relief washed over me. "I appreciate that. I'm not ready for everyone to know yet." "Coming out is personal," he said gently. "Everyone has to choose their own path and pace. No one should push you before you're ready." After that, the conversation flowed effortlessly. We discovered a shared love for classic literature and folk music. He told me about growing up in a small Midwestern town, surprisingly similar to our coastal one. I talked about my job at the library and my dream of writing a novel someday. The afternoon light faded into evening, and I was startled when I checked my watch. So much time had passed. "I should probably get going," I said, reluctant to leave. "My parents will wonder where I am." Father Jack nodded, though I thought I caught a similar reluctance in his eyes. Reluctance flickered in his eyes. "Of course. Thank you for joining me." As we stepped outside the cafe, a light rain had begun to fall. Without hesitation, Father Jack offered to walk me back to my car, still parked at the church. We shared his umbrella, walking close together to stay dry. The closeness felt comforting, yet stirred something inside me I couldn't quite name. When we reached my car, I turned to thank him. But the words caught in my throat when I saw the look in his eyes. There was an intensity there I hadn't seen before, or maybe one I hadn't allowed myself to notice. "William," he said quietly, "I want you to know how much I've appreciated our talks, how much I've appreciated getting to know you." Something in his voice made my heart race. "I've appreciated them too," I replied, though my voice sounded distant, unfamiliar even to myself. He looked like he wanted to say more, but held back. "I'll see you tomorrow at service," he said, finally. I nodded, unable to find the right words. He gave me a small, almost wistful smile, then turned and walked back toward the church, the umbrella bobbing gently above him in the rain. I sat in my car for a while before starting the engine, trying to untangle the strange tension that had settled between us. Had I imagined it? Was I reading too much into kindness, into warmth? I drove home in a haze, barely noticing the streets I'd traveled. I had driven those streets many times before. That night my sleep was restless, my dreams filled with fragments. His voice, our conversations, half-formed images I couldn't quite remember upon waking. Saturday arrived with clear skies and a nervous energy tightening in my chest. I took extra care getting ready for church, spending more time than usual picking out my clothes and fixing my hair. My mom noticed. "You look nice today," she said as we drove together. "New shirt," I muttered, staring out the window, avoiding her curious glance. At church, Father Jack had returned to his usual clerical robe, carrying out his duties with the same grace and warmth as always. His sermon, just as he'd said, was about authenticity and faith, about showing up as your full, unfiltered self in your relationship with God, instead of hiding behind a carefully polished mask. He never looked directly at me during the sermon, but somehow it still felt like the message was meant just for me. After the service, I stood with my parents in the receiving line. When we reached Father Jack, he greeted them warmly, asking after my father's health and promising to visit later that week. Then he turned to me. His expression was friendly, professional, but behind his eyes there was something quiet, personal, just for me. "Good to see you, William," he said, clasping my hand. His touch lingered just a moment longer than usual,